This book is a 24 books of the Tanach. What we're going to discover is that in Judaism, there's two canons. There's a closed canon and an open canon. A canon is a Greek word that means measuring stick. And it is a term that they use for any body of literature that has a certain significance. So the Jewish canon, the biblical canon, is a limited one, 24 books. On the other hand, the open canon is all the other works of Judaism. We call them both Torah. And it's very confusing when you call the same child, you call different children with the same name. Hey, Mendy. You know, Mendy is a very common name among Chabad Hasidim because it's a short version of Menachem Mendel, was the Rebbe's name. So Mendy, you say Mendy in Brooklyn, everybody turns around. You say Yossi, my generation, was the previous Rebbe, half the people turn around. So the problem with Torah is that we have a term of Torah where the 5 books of Moses, as is rolled up in a scroll, that's called Torah. And then you have what we're doing right now. Oh, we're studying Torah. We're studying Hasidic thought. What are you doing? Studying Torah. Oh, he's going to say some words of Torah. Please share a Torah thought. So what is that? In other words, not just a commentary on the Torah, but also ends up becoming Torah itself. And what we're going to discover is that there are 2 Torahs. There's a written Torah, which is fixed, and an oral Torah, which is expanding. In that expanding universe of the oral Torah, there are certain works that are fixed. The works get fixed, but commentaries on them, super commentaries, other things spread out from them. Now, please feel free to interrupt this class because it's a small group of us. But I want to say is that we're going to take a look. There are insiders and outsiders of Torah. There are people that are looking from the inside and they have a certain perspective, and there's an outside perspective. The fact is that we have to understand how we view it, and we're looking at it from the outside, and then we can discuss a little bit about how did Jews view the Torah themselves. In other words, how have Jews viewed Torah for 3,300 years is different than how Jews today in America may view Torah. So we have to expect that. And although I welcome all questions, I want to try to avoid trying to prove the truth of a statement or not. I don't mind any questions, and I can say, look, something is verifiable, something stands up to scrutiny, other things are faith-based. We'll talk about that. But I'm open to that. I just want to say I don't want to end up going down a rabbit hole debate, although I don't see I have that much of a problem here that most people are not coming with that attitude. Yes.
Since you offered.
Please.
So I guess when you talk about oral Torah, it's not only something that is expanding, but something that may predate the written Torah in some ways.
We'll have to talk about that. So Dr. Chego just made a statement that a written Torah, if we say there's an oral Torah, maybe there's an oral Torah before there's a written Torah. Maybe the writing comes down afterwards, like in many other cultures. First, ideas develop over time, and then finally they're written down, and then you have a body of knowledge that then has an oral Torah and explanation afterwards. So you have the development of the ideas, the formalization of the ideas, and then the adaptation and discussion of the ideas. That's a possibility that we're going to have to explore. I don't want to take a side in this yet. Continue.
Yeah. Well, I guess when you think about the forefathers and the patriarchs, there was a lot of ideas that they had that were before the written Torah.
Correct.
But then the question is, when does it begin?
We're going to talk all about that. We're going to cover all that. We're going to talk about when it begins and how it develops and what is its relationship to the written Torah. Okay, so just for the basics, the first thing we're going to do, we have that timeline that's up here. You can't see it here, it's too small. So the Torah what is the Torah? It's a parchment scroll kept in a synagogue. Everyone's familiar with that. You know what I want to do? Let me just do this. Bear me for a second. I'm just going to hit record on this. Someone asked me to record it.
Let's start all over now.
No, not important. Okay, so the Torah is a parchment scroll kept in the ark of the synagogue, and number 2 it is Jewish literary works compiled through history. That's what Torah is, two separate things, exact same name for two separate things. These two separate things are related to one another, and they're two halves of a whole, as we're going to discover, and they need each other in more ways than you would imagine from the first thought. Yes.
Does B include the Talmud?
The B includes the Talmud, correct. It's going to include, we're going to have a very liberal view of what we call Torah. That does not mean that that these works of Talmud, Mishnah, Midrash are open-ended. They also become canonized. They also have a close. They have a beginning and an end where no one is to add to that work. You could comment on the work, but you become a different work. They're still all part of this continuum called oral tradition, which, as is clear from our conversation here, that it's not just a tradition, it's also a creation of the human being and of the Jewish people in a partnership with God, is what the argument is going to be. I want to first start with the facts and then go into some of the interpretation of the facts. In other words, any explanation I give for the meaning of the relationship between written Torah and oral Torah is an explanation. The fact that there is a written Torah and is an oral Torah, and what Jews believed about it, that's a little more of a fact. Yes.
Very quick. So Torah, the word, it also probably means something that may be expanded in meaning.
Right. Torah means lesson.
So it could be very limited or more expanded.
Correct, but becomes specifically for 5 books of Moses as well. That scroll, which is about a fifth of this book, which includes 24 books of the Bible, 900 odd chapters that are in the text. 929 chapters of Tanach, 187 chapters are of the 5 books of Moses, and as you're going to discover, the Jews didn't even make up the chapters. All right, we'll come back to that. So here's the thing: I do believe it's important to throw out how people view it. In my experience, I think there are 3 types of attitudes towards the Torah. One is I call the Christian approach. The Christian approach is that when they read the Bible, everything is a prefiguration of Jesus. There's one explanation to every verse. And God created heaven and earth, Jesus. And Abraham bound Isaac, Jesus. And everything's a prefiguration because that's how they read it. I remember a rabbi, Emmanuel Shochan, they used to pull him in for debates with Hebrew Christians and people, missionaries. And he once said to this fellow said to him, this young man said, "I know the Bible forwards and backwards." He says, "No, you don't. You know it backwards and forwards. You're reading eisegesis. You're reading everything into the text. You start out with a conclusion, and then you read backwards and make it fit into the Bible. You don't know it forwards, backwards. You don't start." He said to him, "I want you to read from the beginning of Genesis through all the way through the Bible, and tell me if you really think by doing that, reading it that way, that what you claim to be true is true." You'll see that's not true. You'll see the Hebrew Bible, what the non-Jews called the Old Testament, and we call the Only Testament, we OT for both of us, exists as a body of literature that does not need and does not want and does not work well or play well with the claims of what these other religions made on Judaism. You could see it. So you always have to do the Bible forwards and backwards, not backwards and forwards. But what do I mean the Christian approach? The Christian approach, which many Jews can have as well, is there's one interpretation of the text. This is a loose definition of mine. I'm calling it the Christian approach. Because the Christians say there's one interpretation of Jesus. There are Jews that say, "Rabbi, I heard 4 different interpretations of this biblical text, but what does it really mean?" That question, what does it really mean, is a misunderstanding of the Jewish approach. The Jewish approach recognizes and embraces a multiplicity of interpretation. And that's what we're going to encounter. That's number one. There's another approach. This approach, we'll say, is the secular approach, the academic approach, which is the Bible was created by many different authors and over a long period of time. And some of them were more primitive and some were more evolved. And it was all put together by a redactor of some sort. And if there's any contradiction in the Bible, it was from a different author, different person. If I don't like something in the Bible, someone else wrote it. There's no deep analysis of text needed anymore because it's always just Someone else, it's not a binding text. All you say is, oh, contradictions must be different authors, sloppy editing, some strange person wrote something. There's no relationship to the text in a serious way. And then there's a third approach. The third approach is some people have, they love Torah as a blank canvas to paint in blue or red, depending on where they stand in the political spectrum. They're going to paint on the Torah canvas what they believe. They're going to use it to promote this party or that party. I'm deliberately not picking a color. Okay, I'm colorblind. I don't know red, I don't know blue. My point is to use Torah as a blank canvas. It's an engagement with Torah by using it to inform, to express your opinions of your life, but it's not informing your life. It's like God loves whatever I want to do. God loves whatever I believe. And I'll show you how it's true. And the Torah is a big repository of many different ideas, and you can pluck what you want and paint a picture that you like. We're going to see the Jewish view is neither one of these three. The Jewish view is that the Torah is eternal, Torah comes from God, Torah is full of significance to such a degree that there's a good term called omnisignificance in the biblical text. That's how Jews viewed it. There was nothing redundant, nothing that is not supposed to be here. And if there are problems, it's for us to be able to delve into. Okay, so let's take a little bit further. Torah is both the Torah scroll and the general Torah, and there are two articulations of the same body of wisdom and knowledge. The Torah scroll is the 5 books of Moses, written over 40 years in the Sinai desert. We started talking about this a little bit earlier, but the writing of it happens in those 40 years. There is debate, does Moses give the people scrolls as the events happen, like right when after they were in the desert for 49 days, and they kept the 10 commandments, and Moses goes up for 40 more days to learn, then he comes down and made the golden calf, he goes up for 40 more days to pray for them, then he comes back down and goes up again a third time, which means from the holiday of Shavuot until Yom Kippur, he comes down the last time is Yom Kippur when he comes down with the second tablets. And then he tells them to build the tabernacle. That's a debate exactly when he tells them to build the tabernacle, but they build the tabernacle, and he's and does he write scrolls then after the tabernacle is built or while it's being built? Does he write the scrolls of Genesis and Exodus till that point? In other words, there's a few portions of Exodus. The point though is there's a debate. We don't know exactly. We do know at the end of the 40 years, he gives each tribe, he writes the 5 books of Moses, and he gives it to each tribe, and a 13th one he puts in the temple, which is in the tabernacle, to be kept for all future times. That is something that across the board, traditional Jews believe. And it's a very important element to understand is they believe, and we believe, that the Torah was given to Moses in the desert, dictated to Moses by God, word for word. It wasn't his own words. Deuteronomy is a little bit different. It's his last speech, 37 days of him talking. That's the 5th book of Moses. We're going to talk about that. And what we're going to discover is that there is 2 components in Torah all the time. There's God and Jews. In certain parts of Torah, God is more predominant, and Jews have a smaller junior partnership role. In other parts of Torah, Jews have a more dominant role, and God's role is less, as we're going to see. But it's always a partnership, and that's what we're going to see. And I want you to just bear that in mind as we begin our journey. Think of the idea of partnership. Think of the idea of Jews and God working in tandem with these texts and with how they develop as well. Okay, yes.
Good question.
Yes.
So one of the final chapters, let's say, of the final book is about Moses not making it to the land that he was leading people to. And there's an implication that he's going to pass away.
He dies. It writes in the last verses, he died.
So the idea is that as either he understands that and he writes the last words of the Torah.
To hear everything's been discussed, so I don't have to even come up with my own answers. If I don't know an answer, I mean I have to look it up. So we had this question earlier, and the Talmud has a debate. the last 9 verses that say, and the whole Torah is written word for word by Moses. How about the last 9 verses? The Talmud, which is a repository of oral traditions, they have 2 opinions about what happened. One is Moses wrote it with tears flowing from his eyes. The other one is Joshua wrote it, and God dictated to Joshua the last 9 verses. Joshua takes over, as you can see in the biblical text, both in the book of Joshua and in the end of Deuteronomy. Joshua is being seen as being right in his place and his successor. So God possibly communicates him with 2 approaches. There's an interpretation that melds the 2 together, which we're going to discover is one of the symbols of Jewish thought, of taking disparate ideas and folding them together. Let me just to back up for a moment. In the biblical text, it's a given. If it comes from God, the contradictions have to be resolved. We do invite diversity of opinion in the oral tradition. Although we do try to come to a conclusion when it comes to law, because we don't want everyone behaving in many different ways. You'll break up the Jewish community. So there is a high court that was designed to resolve every Jewish law question. Nevertheless, we believe a part of Judaism is debate, and we're very comfortable with more than one approach to a text. On the other hand, there is always an idea of trying to show how some ideas can be united one with the other. So there is a later interpretation that says you can write invisible letters with tears. That Moses, how do you reconcile these 2 interpretations? Moses, one interpretation of Talmud says he wrote it with tears. The other one, Joshua wrote it. So the way you can reconcile it, he wrote with tears, like invisible ink, that you could see under a certain light. And then Joshua filled it in. Because one of the interesting element is that we're going to discover is that the dictation of the text to Moses is unique. That makes the 5 books of Moses have a status, and the book of Joshua does not. The book of Joshua, what was experienced there was prophecy. Here was dictating text, a whole different ballgame. Okay, we're going to come to the differences there as well. So the general Torah is hundreds of thousands of writings. Just to give a picture, right now on a hard drive, on a zip, on a what do you call a chip? A chip. One of those drives, the thumb drive. You can have a work called the Otzar HaChachma. Otzar HaChachma is a repository of Jewish books that used to be a hard drive. Now it can be on a disk, on a thumb drive. 120,000 works that we have today. There are many, many more that have been printed and have been lost that we don't know about. There are many, many more that were manuscripts that disappeared, that we're only discovering now. There are thousands of manuscripts that have turned up in the Vatican Library, in Oxford, in Berlin, and people are publishing them today, things from hundreds of years ago that were quoted by other sources that have been lost. We have an incredible libraries of ideas and books and works. All that is called Torah. All that is called Torah. And it's been written really not over 3,300 years. The 24 books is closed. The canon, we're going to talk about it's closed. Its last written book is about 2,400 years ago of this point of this. And in the next 400 or 500 years, there was a restriction on writing other works. The oral Torah was strictly kept oral to differentiate it from the written Torah. And books that were written by Jews, either in Hebrew or in Greek, Hellenized Greeks, they do not end up in the canon, and Jews rejected them actively. This is called the Apocrypha. We're going to get to the Apocrypha in a minute. The Apocrypha appears in the Catholic Bibles. Many of them were written by Jews. Some were written in Hebrew, some were written in Greek, but they were not considered sacred literature. Therefore, they were rejected. There was a fear that people would fold them into the text. So Jews avoided written works that were not from the Torah. There was a time period where the oral Torah had to be written down, which we're going to get to. Okay, we're going to get to all these ideas. I just want to throw out. What were you going to say? We had a question?
Yeah, just the Torah scroll.
Yes.
Dictated by God to Moses.
Correct.
And so everything that's there or can be thought of or conceived of as this is clearly the word of God.
Correct.
When you go to the general Torah,
Absolutely, very different attitudes, totally different attitudes, and we're going to get to that. Okay, so all right, general Torah continues. All right, the written Torah, the text is you're not allowed to change it, and we Jews have worked very hard to ensure that the letters and the words and the text, as we're going to discover, was kept unaltered. This is our obsession, as we'll get to. The other element of the written Torah is every letter is significant, and it includes the 24 books of the Tanach. It's called the written Torah. But there is a difference between the different types of, there are three things. If you look at the back, Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim, the 5 books, the prophets, and the writings. The writings of the prophets are very similar. Some say the primary difference between them is the writings were, to begin with, books. They were written as books, they were composed as books. And the prophets were records of events and stories that happened and speeches that the prophets gave and then were written down. Others say that these are subtle differences. It's really not that important. Other idea is that the book of the prophets were all prophecies that were said to be told to the people, and other ones may have been written with the same prophetic insight, but they're books of wisdom or books of prayer. They're not about the prophecy stories. But either way, there's a third approach, which is the approach that we have here in the text, which is about sanctity. There's a level of prophecy that was existing that's different between the 5 books, the prophets, and the writings. So the 5 books, let's take a look here, sorry. So the oral Torah is all about a relationship of people. It was meant to be communicated person to person. It was not meant, it was the ideas and the concepts. Going back to this issue, in general, the oral law is about conveying ideas and concepts. In the written 24 books is about conveying the letters and the words. So this is a very important distinction. In other words, oral Torah was all about conveying the idea. If you write it down, you limit it. But then if you write it down, you'll have a commentary and a super commentary, like we actually see happen. And you're going to see it to such an nth degree based on other values of Judaism. These things will not stop growing. Now, originally the idea was that you have a written Torah, then you have the oral Torah, which, so to speak, responds to new situations, but you're more conveying the kernels and the ideas. So there's a relationship of people. You can't be a Jew alone in Judaism. To be a Jew alone originally. Nowadays, everything's online. You could go sit in your mother's basement from today till tomorrow, and no one has to know you're there, and you can do everything you want to do except pray with a minion. But my point is, it used to be to engage in Judaism and the study of Torah. The 24 books was just the kernel. The engagement of Torah study and analysis of text and understanding how it related to your life was done through teacher and student. People versus book. But we need both, as we'll see. All right, so originally, yes.
Sorry, so the oral Torah, was that like given orally to Moses, and then Moses given orally to the?
We're gonna get to the definition of the oral Torah and what was given at Sinai, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Hold the question. I want to come back to that. This is an important step. So it's handed over from teacher to disciple. Originally, you weren't supposed to write it down, and it includes teaching succeeding the 24 books of Tanakh. So now the Torah was designed to exist in 2 formats. Number 1 is books. Number 2, people. That's how it was meant to be. And the 24 books of Tanakh, which is Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim, made up of those 3. So the Tanakh includes all different types of wisdom. You have ethics, history, philosophy, law. It's all that and more. In other words, if you open this up and you open up to Bereshis, it's the history of the early pre-Jewish people from Adam and Eve all the way until the Jews go to Egypt. You open up Leviticus, it's laws of kosher and sacrifice and purity and impurity. You have laws about love your neighbor. Then you have books like Job about why do bad things happen to good people. You have all sorts of works and books that each one of them is a kernel. The basic idea is like this, is what we're going to argue is that this is the DNA of all future Jewish learning. And you're gonna have to tell me if it's the genome or the gene, if we're saying that of the Jewish people as a whole, what happens is that everything that flows out of it and becomes all these other Torahs, all of it looks backward and takes its form, shape, life force from here. Everything has to be linked to here and comes from here. So just like in a relationship, when there's a child who's going to be born, there's going to be some element of seed that is placed in the womb and it develops there. We are the womb of the Torah, the Jewish people, and it develops. But when it develops, what's going to happen is it's going to have within it, everything that grows is going to be related to this and of the same DNA. That's the argument. And there's a partnership, just like there's a womb and there's going to be seed and egg, in a similar fashion, there is a partnership. I want to take a quick look at this idea for a moment. If you go back to the first, what's the first time God communicates to all the Jews together? Sinai. 10 Commandments, right?
Yeah.
Now, the 10 Commandments were every Jew heard from God. Can you get any closer to God than that? That's the closest they get. So if you had to define the partnership, that was 99% God. I'm just using numbers here. You can make up your own numbers. 99% God, 1% Jews. Matter of fact, according to a close reading of the text of the 10 Commandments, it shifts from singular, I am the Lord your God, to talking about God in the third person. In other words, it seems like God is no longer talking directly. It says you should, it speaks of God not as the first person anymore. What happened here? So some say, and we could analyze that later, but some say is that the Jews couldn't handle it based on other verses, and they said to God, there are other texts that imply this, that we can't handle it, and God says, okay, I'll tell Moses, Moses will tell you. So what happens? In those 10 Commandments itself, you have a shift. The first 2, they hear it from God directly. The next 8, they hear God talking to Moses, and then Moses communicates to them. Whether we're using that interpretation or not, even they heard all 10. The next 4 books, God tells Moses, and Moses writes down and gives to the Jews. So now we have the text, we have to keep the text. So it's not the same as hearing directly from God. There's now Moses. There's now a human involvement. Let's give it 15% human, 85% God. Then you have the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is Moses' last 37-day speech that he says to the Jews. And then God tells them, okay, I took notes. I want you to write down. And Moses said, in other words, there is a bigger element of man in the 5th book than the other 4 books. It's almost like an oral tradition. It's Moses teaching, and then I told you this, and then I told you that. Sorry, not Moses, I told you. And then I said to you. And God tells Moses to write this down. Those 5 books are, again, a combination. Then you have an oral tradition, which will be for example, God gave certain rules of interpretation. How do you extrapolate from the text a law or a teaching? There are some principles. So God gave that to humanity. And when human beings use that, when they have a court of law and they're following God's rules of interpreting a law, there's a partnership here. Let's call it 50-50 right now. But then there's something like Hanukkah and Purim, where God says to the Jewish people in the Torah, you, the sages, the high court can legislate a new law. They can make up a holiday like Hanukkah or Purim. And they did. Let's give that 80% humans, 20% God. So in other words, what you have here throughout all of Judaism is this sort of partnership. How that partnership, what is the material, the rules, the way it develops, we're going to analyze a bit more. But this is the gist of it. Everything's a partnership, and everything the human being is involved. And we're going to see even in the transmission and keeping alive the written Torah, there's a very big human connection. Okay, so here we have philosophy, law, all these different types. So the core of Torah, instruction, a guide towards life, in the first 5 books is primarily the mitzvahs of the Torah, detailing the do's and don'ts of life. Every aspect of the Torah is somehow an instruction for life. Torah Chayim. That's what the 5 books of Moses are. The first 180 odd chapters. The 3 modes of divine communication is the way Maimonides puts the distinction, and many followed in his footsteps afterwards, which is there's levels of communication. God speaks directly to Moses, and he says, write it this way. How do you spell it? Moses says. God tells him how to spell it. Because in Hebrew, vowels can either be, they're all invisible in the text. The biblical text has no vowels, as we're going to see in a moment. But some letters can be a vowel placeholder. You can spell a word with a vav to make the O sound or the U sound, or without it. God tells Moses exactly how to write it. Okay, that is, it says in the biblical text, God spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his fellow. Then we have another type of revelation, prophets. Prophets would see a vision, lose consciousness, lose awareness in a dream at night. If I'll be a prophet, I'll make known a vision, I'll speak to them in a dream. And then we have, so all 613 mitzvot, by the way, are within the 5 books of Moses. We do not derive Jewish law from any of the other works of the Tanach. Jewish law is only the 5 books. And here's a very important element. To derive Jewish law, once the Torah, the 5 books was written by Moses, you can't be a prophet anymore. You have to be a sage. If someone wakes up one day and says, God told me from now on, everyone has to wear green socks. We don't accept that. If a guy says, I'm a prophet, you have to believe me that God told me this is a new law of the Torah. Torah says that guy gets a death penalty. In other words, we do not allow for prophecy to create a new religion. It says it in the biblical text. You do not believe or accept someone who claims that they're telling you new revelation, because the revelation of law happened once in the Sinai desert. All Jews saw it by the 10 Commandments. Moses is the close of that. All law is only from the 5 books, and in the oral tradition, we call them wise men or sages, and even till this day, where you could use precedent or other techniques to be able to determine what is God's will. The oral law is no longer, the law is no longer given to prophets once Moses is done writing the 5 books. So the rest of the prophets and writings is not about law. So what are these other books doing? These other 19 books? I'm sorry? Well, they're not, the Tanakh is not always interpreting it. A lot of it's prophecy. So what do prophets do? So as a rule, prophets neither subtracted nor added to what's written in the Torah. If it seems like they did, we struggle with that, and we have to reconcile that. Because you could imagine what it does if you allow someone to say, hey, God appeared to me last night, we're canceling the whole Torah. No more kosher, no more Shabbos, no more circumcision. We're going to make a new religion, or even not a new religion. There's no life to Judaism. The whole point of Judaism is, and it says in the Torah, these words will never be forgotten. These words should never be subtracted from nor added to. These works, the 5 books, are the source of law that can't be added nor changed. Okay. So what do the prophets do then? Prophets, I'm sorry? They would, very good. So they would tell people to repent. The end is near. They would warn them about some future calamity, how to avoid it, and also give hope for future promises. But they would teach morality and ethics and all that, but never teaching law. They would teach you how to behave better. They would remind you what it says in the Torah of Moses. But the interesting thing about prophecy is that we believe many more people than the 40-odd prophets that were in the text that we know of existed. The only prophecy that were recorded for all future time were ones that were relevant for all future time. In other words, there's a belief that there was a time period where God communicated to man with these visions more than it happens today. But the only works that were written down, the only words that were written down and kept for all future time had to have future relevance as well. So that's another important element here that we have to recognize, that the belief is that it's not just recounting of things past, but have a message for today in the Tanakh as well. Okay, so there is this view of levels of divine inspiration. For writings, King David said, the Spirit of God spoke to me and his word is in my tongue. And so you have Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. Torah is all 3, Tanakh is all 3 sections, are forms of divine revelation. Okay, So I want to jump in. I just added some slides, which I think will be helpful for us. The academic approach today in Judaism starts, we'll call it the secular approach. Most people in some way have assimilated this into their mindset of how the world views the Torah. Number one is the Hebrew Bible is a collection of books like any other. It was created and put together by normal, fallible human beings, number one. Number two is the Hebrew Bible is often inconsistent because it comes from many different sources that do not always agree. Individual books are multi-layered and grow over time. The Hebrew Bible is a document of its own time, and it's interpreted by looking at what people were doing in Babylon, in Israel, in the Middle East at that time. Number four, it's ideologically driven, it's not objective or neutral. Its historical books are not historical in our sense. That is the academic approach. Yes.
So one thing that I was wondering always about when we say prophets, which is a translation, and Nevi'im and Hanavi would be essentially the word, right? Singular of that. How close is the meaning? Is there more meaning to that Hanavi, for example, than the prophets?
Yeah, so the word Navi comes from different words, either the movement of lips, there are different interpretations of Nivsa Pasayim, what the etymology of the word is. But a prophet was a person who, the belief is that when a prophecy happened, it was more real, more true than something that you would know on your own through intellectual investigation or even touching with your senses. And the proof, for example, would be Abraham bringing up his son as an offering, even though it made no sense on any level, but he was convinced God told it to him. So the belief is that prophecy is real and God communicates in it. The way it would work in general would be they would see a vision and they would know what it meant, but they would use their own words to describe what it was and what they meant. But there was no room for making a mistake. The belief was God did communicate to man. That is what prophecy is about. Not with words, they had an experience, but they knew exactly what it meant. Why that doesn't exist today is another question, what the parameters were, who got it. It wasn't for ignorant people. It's described the greatest, wisest men and women who connected their mind to God would get this gift of prophecy. All right, either way, we come back to prophecy. Here's the Jewish view, though, of the Torah is a very different ballgame. Number one is, it's factually and morally true. Number two is, it's qualitatively different from regular books because it was revealed or inspired, depending on the books, by Hashem. So the writings, according to that reading, were more inspired prophecy, which is, it was as if the person felt driven to write these words that they felt was coming from something beyond them, and it was totally inspired. Now, again, people can have things that feel like that, but prophetic inspiration was one which was believed to be the word of God. Otherwise, that system doesn't. Let me just finish these four, and then so the other element is harmonious and perfect, is what we believe. Inconsistencies are only apparent. Number four, it's eternally true. In other words, it speaks to every time and every place. Someone can't say, hey, Rabbi, if God had tasted lobster, it wouldn't be forbidden. Or God didn't know about a car, so therefore the combustion engine is not called kindling a flame. In other words, God is eternal. God is above time. If it says in the Torah, it's relevant in some way for me right now. What were you going to say, Doctor?
So in Ketuvim and in the writings, you have chronicles, for example, which is really just the description of
Events.
history, events, generations of people. So is it also something that should be interpreted in this sort of more elevated way, or is it just the
Every word.
time?
So we're going to discover that there are many layers of reading, but every word can have layers of meaning, even the most seemingly insignificant word, even the genealogy. I'll read a quote from Maimonides in a few moments. Let's take a look at the text that I
have
printed out. Yes, please.
like number three, harmonious and perfect and
Yes.
inconsistencies. I don't know what you mean by inconsistencies.
In other words, in one place it says one thing, another place it says something else. We have to somehow reconcile that. Because if it's from God, it's deliberate.
Right. So here's an example, like usury. That is from the five books of Moses, right? Somewhere like Deuteronomy, something like that.
Right.
Right now, it's not being followed, right? Or how
Well, it is being followed, but another conversation how it's being followed. There are free loan funds, and there are ways that basically, if someone, you're allowed to make money on a business deal with somebody, so if you become an investor, you can do that. As a matter of fact, loans can be structured as business investments, and that's how they're done today. It's another conversation, but there's no question, the inconsistencies we're talking about here is in text, not in behavior. In behavior, you have another point. Your point is, are we always living up to what the Bible says? Are religious Jews keeping those things? So they're going to say that whatever we're keeping is based not just on this book, but on this oral tradition that knows how to use this system. And we're going to discover how the system works. We're not going to uncover every law, but we'll be able to see how that system works, where there are elements that may seem contradictions, elements that are no longer relevant. No one's offering sacrifices in their backyard today. Why did we stop doing it? Because we don't have a temple. The zoning board would love it, right? I want permission to slaughter animals. I think in Hartford, they just gave permission, or somewhere they gave permission to people do this in the backyard. Okay, let's take a quick look at this for a moment. I want to look at text number 2 for a minute. Okay, I'm going to paraphrase text number 1. You know what? Text number 1. Would you read text number 1, just the first paragraph, Dr. Lutchenko, the 8th principle?
The 13th principle.
This is the 8th of the 13th, exactly.
The eighth principle, that the Torah is from heaven, and that is that we believe in this Torah that is given to us through Moshe, our teacher, peace be upon him, and it's completely from the mouth of the Almighty, which is to say that it all came to him from God. May he be blessed, in a manner that is metaphorically called speech. We
don't know what that thing is exactly that God spoke, because Maimonides is struggling with this idea of God. What does it mean, speech? God doesn't have a mouth, he'd be creating a sound. Whatever it is, it's somehow word for word, not just an image. Skip the next paragraph and start, just read the first line of the next one.
And there's no difference between, and the sons of Ham were Cush and Mitzrayim. And his wife's name was Nehed Kabel. And Timnah was his concubine. On that account, and I am the Lord your God.
So Esau's list of who he married and his bad choices in life of his wives and kids and grandkids is just as holy as I am the Lord your God, because every word is from God. Every letter has significance. This is a principle of faith, even that is central to Judaism. Because they're all from the mouth of the mighty, and all called the Torah of God, complete, pure, and holy truth. Okay, let's turn to number 2. I always print out more than I need, because I have this. My wife does this with cooking for Shabbos, and I do it with text. Okay, so text number 2 is a fascinating issue of the Apocrypha. What is the Apocrypha? The Apocrypha are books that are being written in the Second Temple period. There are things that Jews only know today because of the Apocrypha. We don't know the Hanukkah story from a Megillah. There's no scroll. There's a book called the Scroll of Antiochus. But in general, much of our information comes from the book of Maccabees. The book of Maccabees are in the Christian Bible, and it's not in the Jewish Bible, but it's a Jewish book. The Wisdom of Ben Sira is a wisdom book that is in the Bible of the Christians, not of the Jews. And he was a righteous Jew, written in Hebrew. It was a big debate for a long time. Was this book written in Greek or in Hebrew first and then translated to Greek? We had no Hebrew versions of it. So in the late 1800s, a fellow by the name of Solomon Schechter was in Cambridge, and he was in a debate with an apostate Jew who had become a professor there as well. Well, this apostate Jew wanted to say that the book of Ben Sira was written in Greek, it wasn't written in Hebrew, and he was debating. And these two women who would travel and had taught themselves many different languages, they came back with fragments of a text they had discovered in Cairo, and they brought it to him. And he thought it was garbage. He recognized it as being a version of the Hebrew Ben Sira, had been lost for 2,000 years. It had been in this huge repository of information called the Cairo Geniza, a fascinating a fascinating discovery for Jewish history and for Islamic history of that whole region, because it has repository of all sorts of things that were ever written in Hebrew that people kept, such as documents and land records and divorce and marriage records, but texts. We have Amani's own handwriting, books that he checked and letters he wrote, recipes we have, whatever you want. But
it's a burial.
so the burial of the book, but it was inside a building, and therefore it was kept. Otherwise, usually it's in the ground and it disintegrates. This was kept in a building, years and years of stuff. And the point is, he discovered this original Ben Sira in Hebrew, and he's so happy because he finally won this argument. You see him gloating, but it ended up being one of the great discoveries of Jewish history. My point is that the Hebrew book, the only people that kept it alive were the non-Jews. They kept it as part of the Bible. The Jews didn't want it. Why did the Jews not keep these texts? Take a look. These are not. There's little quotes about it scattered around the Talmud. So, Ms. Lipchenko, take a look at. I'm going to read the first. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read this. Number 3. We're talking about. It says different people have no share in the world to come. Read number 3, not number 2.
Rabbi Akiva
Yeah.
says, also he who reads outside books.
If you read outside books, you don't have the Apocrypha, you're not going to heaven. Why? What's that about? So what does he say? For example, I'm sorry,
For example, books of Ben
Sirach.
Sirach and Ben Lana.
These are books of Jews who are writing in the Second Temple period. Rabbi Akiva lived in the year 100 of the Common Era. Okay, what happens?
The books of Homer and all books written from now on, one who reads them is like one who reads a letter.
That's okay. You want to waste your time? You can read Homer, but don't read those Jewish books that are not sacred literature. Why? Written in that period. Doesn't say why. So he says here, he quotes Ecclesiastes, which is one of the last books to enter into the canon, which says, of making, the last 3 verses of the book says, of making books, there's no end. Beware of making too many books. Basically, the text is read and understood in later years, not just the text and tradition, that there's a close of the Bible. There's a canonization. It's done. And therefore, you have to be careful not to have other books get folded into it. So any books of wisdom, forget about the ones of heresy. Some were written by Greek Jews who were heretical. They were Hellenized. But even books written by good Orthodox Jews were not accepted and were told not to copy, because we're trying to keep till the Bible is clear that it's the Bible, and anything else that's being written is going to be outside the canon. We didn't want writing. We did not want other writing. Take a look at Josephus. Take a look. This is an important element. Josephus is on page 5. I'm sorry, on number 7. Number 7 is Josephus. Okay, number 5, we're just going to paraphrase. Number 5, it tells you who wrote all the different 24 books of the Bible. But that's on your sheet and it's in the video. Don't worry about it too much. The issue of canonization, when these books were done. So Josephus is our own Benedict Arnold. He was a Jewish general who went over to the Roman side because he saw who was winning. But he wrote histories of the Jews, and he was attacked by another writer, this Greek writer, Roman writer, who was casting aspersions on his history. And he says, my histories come from the Bible, and we're not like the Greeks that have books without end. We have very specific, carefully kept, annotated books. Take a look, Barbara, if you would read one, do for 1:8.
For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have, but only 22 books, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine, and of them 5 belong to Moses, which contain his laws and the traditions of the origin of mankind till death.
All right, so he defines, because he wants to protect his history, he makes the order a little bit different about historical books. So he says, first there are 5 books of law. Even the non-Jews called it the book of the law. The next section, he says, we have historical works, which are all the other books of the prophets and book of Chronicles. Some of these things are from the writings. So he mentions all of them. He says 22, not 24, and that we can talk about a little bit. But some of the books could have been together, such as the different approaches. Either Ruth is together with Samuel, with the book of Judges, or the different books that were written by the same author. Jeremiah, for example, also wrote a book called Lamentations about crying over the temple. They could have been together, or it's possible that it wasn't yet canonized, because it gets canonized in the next 50 years, where it's closed 100%. We're going to talk about a process of a few hundred years of a period where they were only writing these 22, 24 books ultimately, and nothing else. And that's what Josephus is describing. The Jews who made the Talmud, who made the Mishnah, who haven't stopped writing, they did not have any other books that except the Bible. Everything was oral. Look what he says a little bit further. He says, in truth, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Our history has been written since Achashverosh, very particularly because we were very careful about letters and words and everything. He says here, no one has been so bold. If you read the last 5 lines, all these years, no one has been so bold. You see that, Barbara? You want to read? Yeah, the last 5 lines. Yeah.
Either to add anything to them, to take anything from them, or to make any change in them. But it has become natural to all Jews immediately, and from their very birth, to esteem these books to contain divine doctrines, and to persist in them, and, if occasion, be willingly to die for them.
This is what Jews did. In other words, these works, he said, Josephus is writing as a historian. The Jews only have the set canon, and they'll die over changing their words and the letters of their text, and they keep it very, very carefully. And we're going to see how carefully. So take a look, though, and we say in text 8, the famous idea that Moses transmits the Torah to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders. So we have here, take a look at the end of 9. Okay, would you read for us, Marty? I mean, I have the other text because it's important, but we're not gonna have a chance to read everything. It's leftovers. Take home, enjoy it over the week. Yes, Abba Shaul said.
Abershal says, the meaning is, not that they waited, rather they explained.
So it says in Ecclesiastes, in Proverbs, that the men of Chizkiah, king of Judah, copied over, and the Hebrew word copied, he's interpreting to mean they waited. What happened?
In the early days, they would say that the Proverbs and Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes would be put away, as those texts spoke parables and were not the Holy Scriptures.
So Song of Songs is a love poetry. Ecclesiastes, there's Proverbs, and then there's Koheles. Koheles is pretty depressing. It's in his old age, Solomon writes. Someone could read it and feel like totally giving up. Not, although there are elements of it which are full of faith in God, but the parts of it seem very depressing. So they were going to hide them. These books were written with divine inspiration, they believed, but they were going to hide them because they did not want them in the canon. They thought they wouldn't be good to have. So they were going to be hidden until the men of the Great Assembly came along, which it did 2,400 years ago. The Great Assembly are 120 sages that come back from Babylon after the Persian story of Purim happens, and they get permission to come rebuild the second temple. Ezra, Nehemiah, some say Mordecai comes back, Daniel, all those people that were in that period of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, end of the destruction of the second temple, and then the story of Purim. Then the Jews get permission.
They came back
But-
from dead.
Not dead, no. Come back from exile. Darius, Koresh, Cyrus, they give permission for the Jews to come back. They rebuild the second temple, and there's a group of 120 sages called the Anshe Knesset HaGadol, the men of the Great Assembly. In Israel today, the Knesset has 120 people to commemorate that. They call themselves the Knesset to commemorate that. But in other words, there's an active copying of that idea. But the point is, they instituted what we would call the first elements of rabbinic Judaism: blessings, prayers. There were different things they had to institute because the world had changed. So give me one more second. They're the antecedents of what we call rabbinic prayer. And according to this version, in 400 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, right in the beginning, these men of the Great Assembly, who they were the leadership until they all die out, and then a regular high court takes over. These people have reestablished, they call it the Second Commonwealth. They explained and justified books like Song of Songs, which seems to be romantic poetry, doesn't seem to be holy. they justified it and explained it's all a metaphor for love of God and the Jewish people. In other words, everything in the Bible had to be seen as having meaning, or they were going to hide it if they were afraid it would lead to negative things. Jews knew how to hide books. We got rid of the Apocrypha. If we didn't like these books, so the Song of Songs staying in the Bible was a deliberate act. As a matter of fact, 400 years later, at the end of the Second Temple, when Rabbi Akiva is around, there was a debate. Again, should we hide? It's like, this is it, where this is the crucial point. Should we hide and get rid of the Song of Songs and some other books? Hide it, bury it, like you would bury a non-kosher Torah scroll or one that was no longer able to be used because it's sacred, but it might lead people the wrong way. And they went again and they explain it and they show, or it's another version of the same story, and they show how it's compatible with Judaism. So this idea, though, there's no question, if you look at the time frame, the last stuff that's written is from the beginning of the Second Temple period, when there were still prophets. We believe all the writing happens when there were prophets. The men of the Great Assembly were a mix of prophets and sages. Malachi, Haggai, Zechariah, Daniel, not necessarily, Ezra, Nehemiah, they were there, they were part of the writing of it. When this canon, this book list doesn't get closed 100% until the Second Temple. But there are no other books added from the beginning of the Second Temple. You have this 500-year period, 400-year period, where the last books were written, and then, so to speak, the stamp of approval by everybody. Josephus and other people speak of these books already existing. They knew of it. There's no translation of the Bible that doesn't have these books in it. But if you ask me when exactly was the list closed, it's not that simple. There's a 400-year period where they're pushing away any other works and they're keeping these. And the list of these exact 24 happened in that period of the Second Temple. But the last writing is the end of the prophets, which is the beginning of the Second Temple period, 2,400 years ago. I just want to be able to clarify, there are things we don't know. Because it was more of a process than of there are some historians that came up with a theory that at a certain point after the destruction, they had a big gathering, and that's when they decided it. And many historians quote that of a gathering in Yavna, but there is no evidence of that. I have no problem with it, but there's no evidence of that. But what is clear, the men of the Great Assembly, who were prophets, are the ones that edit the last writings of these works. Yes.
So when we go back to this particular text and you see that they wanted to put it away, or they more specifically before the Great Assembly.
No, it's among them. In other words, it's them. The Great Assembly is 120 men. They're debating. They are debating. Some of them want to get rid of it, and they said, "Hold on, let's investigate if we could find the prophetic nature of it, of why it should be in the canon." And they answer things. They resolve problems.
So before that, before the Great Assembly,
Right.
People read lots of other things.
Right, and there were prophets around. So the writings, they took place over time. We don't know exactly when they were, so to speak, being transmitted. Look, when Moses died, there's only 5 books of Moses. These other books are going to, which is 3,300 years ago. The other books are going to develop over the time as they happen. Are they begun to be read publicly? Not necessarily. They're studied, but those are the only works, so to speak, that the Jews let exist from 2,500 years ago. We don't know what existed before. We don't know. Maybe, but the idea though that the ones that are included are prophecies that are meant for all future times. And God tells them, the idea is that God tells the prophet to write it down. That was one of them that we didn't read. I
It
paraphrased.
would have been something from Solomon.
Right.
Something else.
Right, but if God didn't tell him to write it, if God told him to write it, it would end up in the canon. If God didn't tell him to write it, it would not end up in the canon. That's basically the gist of it. We want to say if God did not tell him to write it, it would not end up in the canon. If someone wrote something on their own. And here's the point. What we do know is that for 2,500 years, we know the Jews, when other books were being written, they were being rejected. And they don't end up in our bloodstream. It's even like intrinsic to Josephus. He says, we don't do that. But they did a lot of learning, and we're going to discover it was a society with a tremendous amount of memorization. Hundreds and thousands of chapters that could be read and memorized that were done, even to this day, there are children that memorize the Mishnah, which is 60 tractates. Tractate is made up of, let's say, an average of 8 chapters, and each chapter is an average of 12 paragraphs, 12 Mishnah. It's designed to be mnemonic devices, with mnemonic devices, designed to be memorized. We're going to discover that. Although today is not the best use of your time, once you reach an age where you can do analysis, but to have the knowledge and information, as we're going to see, the biblical text, there are many Jews that know it all by heart, even though you're not supposed to say it by heart, but if you learn it every day and you sing it with the tunes, like Moroccan Jews, you'll meet taxi drivers in Israel that know the whole Tanach by heart. And they'll tell it to you, and they'll be surprised. What kind of rabbi are you? You don't know the 24 books by heart because they grew up with it. We're going to get to this issue of the text, though, which I really want to, which I feel is very important. This is a Torah scroll. The scrolls last about 500 years under great circumstances. We have some that are about 1,000 years old. So this one is a sheet. It's not a whole Torah scroll, but if you look on the left, that is the Song of the Sea. The Song of the Sea, on the screen, it's on the left, is the Song of the Sea. It's written in a certain traditional manner. And our Bible scrolls till this day are written exactly the same way. This is in Bologna. They thought this was written much later than it was actually written because the person, the librarian, was not familiar with this type of script. He didn't understand how old it was. They did testing, and this is again about 1,000 years old. Look at the sea. This one is on the right. It's rolled. It's a scroll. It's exactly the same. 1,000 years. How did we do this? For 1,000 years, written word for word, a couple 100,000 letters in this text.
This is rules on how to describe the Torah.
Right, but how do you? But if you ever see what happens when people copy manuscripts, there are tons of mistakes. The Torah is read out loud in every synagogue in order throughout the world. It has to be verbalized. It has to be vocalized. It has to be sung with a song and a tune. And if anyone makes a mistake, if you're ever in an Orthodox show and you'll hear you make a mistake, ooh, you read it wrong. Even if you're the bar mitzvah boy and you practice all year, they're not going to have any mercy on you. They're protecting the Torah. The Torah has been kept word for word, letter for letter, tune for tune. There's no vowels in this. How was it kept? It was kept by an oral tradition called vowels, called tunes. How many people here can read music? You two. One. Both. Oh, one. How many here can sing a song? Most people can sing a song. You don't have to know how to read music to sing a song. Without musical notes. In a Torah today, in a Chumash, in the 5 books, you're going to have musical notes in here. In the scroll, there's no musical notes. You have to know it. You have to know the song. The whole Torah is called a song by Moses. Write this song, God tells him. This whole thing is a song. And it was designed with musical notes, but the musical notes are not there any more than if you and I are singing a song. The musical notes are oral tradition. The vowels, oral tradition. This is why you have to read Hebrew out loud. You'll see even educated Jews who read Hebrew move their lips. They're not looking with their eyes because there are no vowels. Words have to be enunciated or you're not going to get it right. Silent reading is a product, according to many, of how many Latin letters they used to make words strung together. And you would visualize and divide, and the vowels were all there. But letters and words without vowels, you have to vocalize. So there's an oral and a written tradition in the written book itself. The partnership part, for example, the Jews had to speak it to keep it. If you weren't speaking it, you weren't going to keep it. But here's what happened. Just like the oral Torah at a certain point had to be written down because of danger of being forgotten, there was concern about the Torah scrolls. So this is from the 19th century. So it's exactly the same. It's the Song of the Sea. It's exactly the same. They're writing exactly the same. Hundreds of thousands of letters. Now, words can be written differently by people. Words can be forgotten. So here's an amazing thing. Now, this doesn't mean there weren't people who were copying in a day when if you only had 24 books, this was your library. Everything else was oral tradition. So people wanted to have the Torah scrolls. By the way, there's no books. The Jews took books much later. We had scrolls. Scrolls is a limit First of all, you have to go through every part of the text to get to it. There's no part of the text that doesn't get rolled through if you want to get somewhere. Everything is seen. If you find a mistake, you have to fix it. If there's more than 3 mistakes on a page, you have to bury it. There were rules given. This doesn't mean there weren't some bad ones. But what's incredible, and here's the problem, what's incredible how we kept it exactly for 1,000 years. Jews living in Yemen, hundreds of years separate from other Jews, their Torah scrolls are exactly like ours. There's a few words where they spell with a vav or without a vav, or a hey, it doesn't change the meaning, it doesn't change the pronunciation, because in Hebrew you could write words with a vav, with a hey, because they're vowel placeholders as well, without pronouncing things. Many words can be written that way. Like in English, you could write Sarah with an AH or an A. It doesn't change its pronunciation, it doesn't change its name. It's exact same pronunciation. In Hebrew, you have many things like that. So there's a few words like that out of hundreds of thousands. How do they do it? Yes.
Good question. So what about the Samaritans?
So the Samaritans is a whole different ballgame, and we'll talk about translations. They have their own Bible, with part of the book of Joshua, that's a medieval creation that they stuck in.
Have they also been able to maintain?
No, not the same way. But there is a Samaritan Torahs, but not the same. But also they're very isolated. They're in one place. We are all over the world. What we're going to compare it to is Septuagint, which is the Greek translation that Jews made for the Jewish Greeks, or rather Egyptians, that were all Greeks at the time. We're all Hellenized people living in Egypt at the time, where we create what's called the Septuagint. There's not a verse, and that became part of the early Christian Bible. There's not a verse without alternative readings among them. They didn't keep it at all like we did. So this is just an interesting one. In Ein Gedi, this they discovered in 1970. It was from a fire. It was a block of charcoal. And if they tried to move it or open it, it would disintegrate. But recently, they were able to, with X-rays and other types of techniques, they were able to scan, not X-rays, other techniques like that.
The Dead Sea Scrolls?
It is not in Dead Sea Scrolls, same area though, same region.
But is that where that old synagogue?
Yes,
I was
right,
there.
right. And with waterfalls are not far. So they discovered this in a synagogue. It was burned in the year 600, and they didn't know what to do with it. But they scan it, and it's a piece of Leviticus exactly word for word from 2,000 years ago, like we have today, word for word. How is this done? Hundreds of thousands of letters. What happened was, this is in about the year 900. There were a group of sages in Israel who were called the Bali Masorah. They wrote the Masoretic text. What is the Masoretic text? It's a book, it's a codex. This is called the Aleppo Codex, or the Crown of Aram Sola. This is the term for this book. Some say it seems like this is the exact one Moses Maimonides copied his Torah scroll from, and he codified it, and it became the example for all other Torah scrolls to be checked in. What's a codex? A codex has the vowels. The biblical text has no vowels, because first of all, it can be read on many different layers of meaning. You don't want vowels. You also don't want to write anything on a Torah scroll. If anyone's familiar with how works develop, what happens is someone has a work, a text, let's say a manuscript, and then you write a note on the side, note to self, don't forget the laundry. And your grandkids give it to someone to copy, and some of it ends up in the text. A much better example, forget the laundry, if someone writes a note, he thinks it should say something else, or he has his own comment. When people copy, they think maybe the editor, maybe it's not a book, it's a scroll. Maybe the author wrote it. These things develop and change within 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. Torah scroll, you can't even write a vowel. You can't touch it, every letter, but you need to have a codex at a certain point. It was all memorized. In the year 900, there were schools of these people that began to find the most accurate text, and they wrote notes. How about if a word was written without a vav, and sometimes with a vav? They would say 17 times in the Torah it was written without a vav, 14 times with a vav. So you should know when you make the mistake. And this is where it is. In other words, all cross-reference, all hyperlinked, every vowel, every punctuation, every spelling, and the original spacing of every Torah. We saw, just to go back, we saw here the spacing. Do you see those spaces? These are the spaces which are called these are the original parshios. The original sections of the Torah were not chapters. There's no chapters in a scroll. There's spaces. And you have to go through the whole thing back and forth. A book is incredible technology. You could go from one thing to another. The Christians, seems in the Vulgate, they were writing their Bible and they were debating with the Jews. They made chapters to be able to find it easier. And the Jews, when they started making texts after that, they had to, if someone's debating with you and you don't know where he's talking about, you seem like an idiot because you're thinking, oh, it's in this portion, but they're saying chapter numbers. So we began to put chapter numbers in our Bibles. But originally, there's no chapter numbers. Originally, there are sections. The sections are designed like this with these spaces that you see on the screen. There's some of them are open, you see, and some of them are closed. Closed means there's words after them. You see that? And open means, and if you open up your Bible for a second in front of you, the Tanach, they made this in that same manner. Open up anywhere at random. Okay? So if you look, there's spaces. Those spaces are in the original Torah text. And that tells you it's a new idea. That tells you it's a new section. But it's also, it tells you different things, if it's open or closed. The relationship of one section to another. Some of them, okay. So how do they do this? Sorry, I'm going backwards. What's fascinating is, so they do this, it ends up in Syria. It was written in Israel, goes down to Egypt for a while. Moses Maimonides copies his Torah, he goes through, he said this is the best. There were whole schools of these people. Ben Usher, Ben Naphtali, these are the Masoretes, the Bali Masorah, that's the term for the Masoretic tradition, the Ben Usher. This is the Leningrad Codex. This is the only complete one we have, because what happened to the other one of the 24 books, we had it all until the Arab riots in Syria, and pieces then were either burnt, pieces were smuggled out, pieces could have been stolen. From Jews may have stolen pieces. It was seen as an amulet of the holiest thing by some people. It's not clear. Someone may have sold pieces on the antiquities market. Some big professors might have been involved. The whole scandal that happened is always a scandal. But the point is, other people have copied it before. So the whole Navi prophets part we have, there's a few pieces we're missing of what's called the Aleppo Codex because of riots and fires that took place in the 60s there. And the Leningrad Codex, which is a similar type of work, we have, it's also about 1,000 years old, and it uses Masoretic text. There is slight differences about there's a certain type of stress in a letter, the meseg. There's a few different things that some have a little bit more of than others. I can show you in a prayer book sometime, like where you put the stress of a word. I mean, otherwise, hundreds of thousands, exactly the same, with notes. All these little symbols are notes telling you how to write it, what to write, and there's a longer one, a shorter version. They have two types of notes. I want to go back for a second just to show you. Is look at the bottom. There are notes on the bottom. There are notes on the side. These are different types of notes, and they all have symbols. Okay. So I want to go a little bit further here. I want to talk about translation for a minute. Every translation is a lie. Yes.
So sorry. I was going to ask, but
No problem.
very tricky, quickly transition. So when technically speaking, so let's say a new scroll is created, is it copied from another scroll?
Yes.
Okay. So can you estimate how many times, let's say, if you look at the specific scroll, how many times you can go back in time? How many times it was?
Look, the long
times was copied.
If someone's right now, there's a synagogue that's using an 900 in Italy, a 900-year-old Torah. So if you think about it, 4 generations, 5 generations could go back, 6 generations, if they're 500-year Torah. You don't know that though. There's no way to tell. These texts don't last normally more than 500 years, unless you put them in the Dead Sea Scrolls in a dry place, in containers. In general, we're not getting these things disintegrate. That's a problem. But the fact that we could do it for 1,000 years so perfectly means it's not so illogical that we couldn't have done it before. In other words, the fact is, here's an element which is not, it's just so clear to me. We're much more dispersed, not now, since there's a printing press, so everyone could copy from the same books and make sure they're all checked. Last 500 years don't prove us anything. We're all following what we're going to see is called the Rabbinic Bible, pretty much. And the way it's written there is how all the Torah scrolls are being copied. Anything written in the last 500 years doesn't tell us anything. But all these scrolls written from 500 years ago to 1,000 years ago, where there are many, 5, 6, 7, before the printing press, many, that had no access, and they're written exactly the same. That means we can do it, and we have done it. And you think how dispersed the Jews were, not like they were once just in Babylon and just in Israel and just in Egypt. They were in Yemen, they were all in Greece, they were in Rome, they're all over the world writing scrolls exactly the same because we were obsessed with every word being the word of God. No one edited it. No one said, oh, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, the Christians in the Septuagint were all about the message. So first they changed elements for Christological reasons. So later on, there was a famous Christian, Jerome, who wanted to make a more accurate from the Hebrew Bible translation, which he tried to do. But the fact is, there already were many Christological references that they had inserted into their text and translated things a certain way. It would have changed their whole Bible. So they were stuck. Here's the fact. The Hebrew Bible is, by the Jews, kept sacred. But we also had translations. But our translations were designed to lead you and connect you to the text. In the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, take a look. I'm not going to read it, but if you don't mind, just look for a second at 12. Reading number 12, it says Nehemiah read on Rosh Hashanah, he read the Torah scroll, and look on verse 8 on page, so it's on page, it's a page after. So it's number 12, verse 8 on top. So it's right above 13. See that?
Yes.
They read from the scroll of the teaching of God, and Hebrew says this. Translating it, says here different words. Meforish in Hebrew, v'som sechel v'yavinu b'mikra. They translated, giving sense so they understood the reading. So here's the Talmud. The Talmud says, we're going to skip a little bit. We're going to skip, here it is. Go to number 16. Would you like to read?
Yeah, Megillah 3a.
Yeah.
The Gemara asks, was the translation of the Torah really composed by Onkelos the convert? Didn't Rav Ika bar Avin say that Rav Hanael said that Rav said, what is the meaning of that which is written with respect to the days of Ezra? And they read in the book the Torah of God distinctly, and they gave the sense and they caused them to understand the reading. Nehemiah 8:8. The verse should be understood as follows. And they read in the book the Torah of God. This is the scriptural text distinctly. This is the translation.
They're explaining the redundancy, that the belief was that already when the Jews came back from Babylon, not everyone spoke Hebrew perfectly. They still were somewhat literate, but they didn't speak it perfectly. Everyone came from different places. Like go to Israel today. There are people that come into Israel that speak Hebrew better than others. Depends where you came from, how old you are, and how good you grasp the languages. So they have some translation. He was reading so that people should understand. Read further in 17. Oh, indicating, so basically, there's a claim that a convert by the name of Onkelos translated the Bible into Aramaic. And the Talmud is saying, but wasn't it already in the time of Ezra? Didn't exist 500 years earlier, 2,400 years ago, in the time period of the Second Temple being rebuilt, before it was even rebuilt, they were already translating the Bible into Aramaic. Take a look further. What else did they do? And they gave the sense.
And they gave the sense. These are the divisions of the text into separate verses.
So you know when to stop. Okay, then.
And they caused them to understand the reading. These are the cantillation notes.
So the reading, in other words, in the Bible itself, there are words that are understood to mean they sang it with a song, they had a translation, all these things they were doing already then. But if you take a look, okay, and some say these are the Masoretic traditions of how the work should be written.
And some say that these are the Masoretic.
Oh, we can stop here. So basically, they want to say that even though a convert in the year 100 translates it into Aramaic, he's recovering or he's canonizing an older translation that already existed. As a matter of fact, we know in the Second Temple period, when Jews read the Torah, they would read a verse, and then their translator would sing a verse in Aramaic. In other words, right now, you go to a synagogue, they're only reading in Hebrew. The way it would work would be out of a scroll, someone would read in Hebrew, and then someone would chant as well in Aramaic. That'd be pretty cool if you did that in English today, although the Torah reading would take double as long. But this way, people understood. But here's the thing, it was read, Hebrew and Aramaic were being said and read at the same time. So it was teaching people the meaning. What happens with a translation, when it's untethered from the text, it gets a life of its own. Every translation is a lie, because every translation is interpretation. Translation in Italy, they would say, is a traitor. Why? You're picking one interpretation. Forget about a biblical text. Interpret something is not the same as translation. If you're going to translate it literally, it won't make sense, especially if it's poetry, especially if it's mystical poetry, especially if every word alludes to something. It's not possible to translate the Torah in a way that it conveys beyond the surface. And even the surface, you can end up with misunderstandings. But in Jews, always link the translation to the Hebrew. This is a very important element. What goes wrong for other Bibles, I'm trying to express here, our Bible is not the same as other Bibles. Our Bible is the Hebrew Bible, not the English translation. If you give me an Art Scroll Tanach or Koren Tanach, I don't care what you give me. They're all interpretations to some degree. They cannot convey perfectly all the nuances and multiple interpretations that a biblical text does. Forget about the notes and the sounds and the vowels and alternative readings that you can read because you don't have vowels. The very translation is dependent on an interpretation. As a matter of fact, okay, sidetracked. I want to jump into this for a second. This is an early manuscript about 700 years ago, written by hand. You see the dragons on top, the hybrids at the top of the book. In the middle is the Chumash. On the right is the Aramaic translation. On the left is Rashi, the famous rabbinic interpreter. The biblical text is written in a way that you're in conversation. This is something which is unique to the Jews. If you write a book and you're Jewish and no one writes a commentary on it, not such a book. A book is engaged in conversation with the text. Why? We need to have the written text and we need to have the oral, but we can't lose the written translations. What happened was when Jews translated into Greek or into Aramaic or into Arabic, for the Jewish translation, it was always linked to public reading of it in Hebrew too. Hebrew was not forgotten in Israel at any point, even if people were less proficient in it, as opposed to what happens with all the other Bibles. There are hundreds of translations out there today, thousands of other Bibles. Every word is different because, first of all, they just believe in conveying the message primarily. They didn't like very exact translations. The Jews liked a word, a translation that gave you the exact translation. So then you have the ability of analyzing the text in a much better way. On the other hand, some, as we'll see, translations were commentaries too. So take a quick look. This is what a page of Talmud looks like. The middle is the Mishnah, the pink, both in the English and the Hebrew. The pink is the Mishnah. That is written in the year 200. The Talmud is the analysis. It's the yellow underneath it. Written from the year, it's composed between 200 and 500, written down 500 to 600. On the right is our friend Rashi, a medieval commentator, his grandchildren, great-grandchildren who debate. On the left, the Baalei Tosfos. Then you have all these other commentaries on the side. Every page is engaged in conversation with the other. Even our biblical text is going to be in a similar fashion, traditional Jewish learning. So this is a code of Jewish law. We're going to learn more about it. But the code of Jewish law, the top line is written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who lived in Tzfat in Israel. He wrote a Sephardic Jewish law. He called this the set table. Meanwhile, in Krakow, an Ashkenazic Jew, Rav Moshe Isserles, he wrote a book that he called the tablecloth. Says this goes together like a horse and wagon. We're going to put together my table with your tablecloth, and they made a book called the Code of Jewish Law. That's the centerpiece. But look around it are the armor bearers. These are called the armor bearers, each one debating sources, disagreeing, agreeing, defending. There's a list of them. This is the Code of Jewish Law. This is what it looks like. Now, when my kids go to school, they're told in 3rd, 4th grade, bring a Mikra'ot Gedolot, bring a rabbinic Bible. What's a rabbinic Bible? This is a rabbinic Bible. A rabbinic Bible has the big bold letters in the middle, is the Chumash. The left is Onkelos. Onkelos is the Aramaic translation written by this convert to Judaism that we mentioned. He may be the same one that wrote a Greek translation that was very literal, that some of the early Christians tried to use as well. Others didn't like it because it was too literal. On the left are two other translations, Yonas ben Oziel and Yerushalmi. See, here we are in a Chumash. We have three different Aramaic translations. Forget about commentary. Then underneath it is Rashi, Ibn Ezra. And then on the right of that is a super commentary on Rashi. What's bothering Rashi? There's only one. There were over 500 works written on Rashi, analyzing his approach and why he chose and what he chose. And they have other commentaries. My point is to understand the relationship of rabbinic and oral tradition in Judaism is that there is this conversation that's taking place between the two. The kernel has to be kept. This is something, and we've done an amazing job of it. Someone could debate and say, Rabbi, how do you know it happened 2,000 years ago? You have no evidence. You're right. But if we could do it from the year from 1,000 to 1,500, when there was no printing press, and Jews are spread out with persecution and Holocaust, and wagons of Jewish literature being burned to the Notre Dame, 1240, the burning the Talmud, the burning codes of Jewish law, persecution, people our Torahs are all the same from those time periods. Incredible. And the stuff you find from 500 years earlier, all the same. From 700 to 1200. That's incredible. If we could do it then, we shouldn't have been able to do it in our land. So the Jewish tradition is our Torah is the same Torah. Now, again, we recognize this issue of the vowels, the placeholders might be off, but otherwise, every word is exactly the same, and we protected it, we kept it, and therefore, it is allowed to be the anchor that keeps all the other traditions tethered to it. So anytime someone's going to say anything in Judaism, it's going to go back to the biblical text. It's going to have to be linked to it in some way. And the oral traditions also get canonized in some point. They also become works, Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash, we're going to discover next week. But nevertheless, there's this relationship of partnership that always exists.